Today's class is going to be more for people who starting to make glasses, and a little bit overview what type of hinges are on the market and what are the most common hinges, and how to measure them, how to use them, what is the best use for each hinge, and how to measure them and actually make a 3D model of the recess and everything. So for this class I choose 4 hinges that I'm using the most. Hopefully you too. So the first one I'm using quite a lot actually is a narrow facial width hinge. I'm not sure if this is I know they are using this term in England for this kind of hinge. Then we're gonna talk about the heat sunk hinge, which is the hinge where you cannot see any rivets on the front of the hinge, and it's all inserted by the heat. And then classic hinge, which is probably the most used hinge in the whole industry, and it's I'm calling it the Wayfarer type because it's a classic. And the one I'm using quite often, because it's for the very small frames and very specific frames. I call it small hinge, and it doesn't have the pantoscopic tilt. So if we start from the first one, narrow facial width, I just took the one I had in my workshop, and I just quickly create like a drawing to see what is the main parts. And actually here I can show you. So when we're talking about the narrow facial width hinge, is the hinge where this front part, which is on the front of your frame, is actually vertical, not horizontal, and that's why you can save a lot of space on your lugs. And I'm using this very often because I can play with the designs and I don't need to change my design according to hinge, and this one fits almost everywhere. So I measured the one I had downstairs, and it's actually quite small. The size for the sides it's 6.1 millimeter. It's quite tall, almost 10 mil. And the most important thing, what I was trying to always how to explain people how to measure their hinges before they start in doing the recess. So if you look at the hinge from this view, like a basically front, and this is where your side is going to be, and you measure this distance, is going to give you some distance here, in this case 5.3, and if you add your sides, it will get you 3 millimeters extra because the hinge is going to be recessed, and it's going to be 8.27 millimeter approximately. So if you look at the frame, it will look something like this on your frame, and I can show you here. This is the frame I choose for this hinge. So I quickly create some shape, and you can see normally if you use normal hinges, you will quite struggle to fit normal hinge on this kind of frame because it's super thin, and it will, if you want to use a normal hinge, you will need to have extended area here. So I choose this hinge, and you can see the recess is on the edge, but it still fits nicely. And how I did this was just to create, as we did it before in our previous class, just to create some shape. And then I already have this hinge in 3D. So I create myself this hinge, which you don't need to do, because only important thing for you is you need to know basically this geometry of your hinge, which is the recess for the front, and this is this little dot here is going to showing you how far it needs to be from the end of your frame. So if you imagine, if you look back on this frame, and I open the sketch for the hinge, you can see I imported this whole geometry here, and this is the distance. This is 8.25, which actually I have here 8.27. So this is the hinge plus 3 millimeters extra for the sides. And you can see, like, if I put this geometry here, just copy paste it here, you can see that it fits nicely. Still, it's in a material, it's not poking out, so it means that hinge will fit in this place. So then I can just finish the sketch, extrude this recess 1 millimeter inside, as you can see, a little bit inside, and that's my recess. And you can see, if I put the hinge here, that you can see that it sits nicely inside, and a 4 millimeter arm, 4 millimeter thickness, is still fitting nicely in your frame. Especially a frame like this, when you want your arms a little bit recessed inside and not maybe touching the edge of the frame. So hopefully, like, this is quite clear that from this is your key sketch, when you can have this distance and and basically the shape of the hinge. Quite often it's you need to when you have your hinges in your workshop, I'm always, when you're doing the recess for the hinges, I'm always making them slightly tighter than the hinge, because I don't drill the holes for the hinge on CNC. I'm doing it afterwards. So my process is making the recess slightly tighter than the hinge, and then press the hinge inside when I do the recess, so it holds there nicely, and then I can use just a drill and drill it through the hinge and make a holes for the rivets. It's like a little tip when you do this recess. I think if you do maybe 0.1 millimeter smaller recess, it's usually perfect for nice press fitting, and it cannot wander in a recess, and it fits perfectly. So I think that's about this hinge. It works perfectly, and you can get them in a, I'm usually using the one with a 6 millimeter part on the side, but you can also get the smaller one, so you don't need to make the arms that big, and you can make super narrow sides. Is it clear, or I'm not sure if I went slightly too fast, or just to clarify how I'm measuring the hinge, or how I'm preparing it for production. Hopefully clear. Now we can take a look at a classic hinge, which is basically this one, when you have on the front vertical holes, and on the side you have horizontal. Normally, even for the old Wayfarers, they have 3 holes. Hello. And it's usually this size can be anything between 4 millimeter and 8 millimeters. So there's loads of these on the market. As you can see, the front part is with the vertical, and horizontal is the side. And this hinge is normally a bit tricky, because you have normally on every single hinge like this, you have a pantoscopic tilt, and you have a little bit of like a tilt for the arms, so arms are folding nicely together. So for the 3D, it's actually quite horrible to use this hinge. It's in a normal life it's easy, but if you just even want to do drawing, it's a bit tricky. And normally these hinges needs to have quite a big lux. So imagine the first hinge we did, it was like you need 8.5 millimeter basically material for your hinge and the lux. With this kind of normal hinge, you will need at least 5 millimeter extra. So you need to choose this hinge for the right frame. And for this one, I choose this kind of frame. So it's basically the Wayfarer shape, and you can see the lugs are actually quite huge here, because you need a lot of space. And here is the hinge, and you can see there is still a little bit of space around, so it's not gonna touch the groove or anything. So that should be the perfect fitting. And if you look here, for this hinge, you need approximately 13.5 if you measure it correctly, this hinge. but even I realize in a real life for this kind of hinges you need to put a little bit of extra. So if you look here, I create this sketch on a frame, and actually instead of 13.5 I put 14 millimeters to fit nicely. And I can open the hinge. This is the hinge itself, and this is just a projected geometry of that hinge. And here is actually even 13. So normally with these hinges I would recommend you to add between 0.5 and 1 millimeter extra, just to be sure it will fit nicely, because all these I have here, sorry. So here's 14, and if you look how the arms looks like, it fits nicely here, but because of the tilt of the hinge itself, you can see that this is not fitting nicely here on this edge. So eventually your frame is not gonna have a straight lux like this, but if you follow your frame nicely, it will look, actually I can show you, if you put a sketch here, you will have the lux a little bit tilted by some degree. Normally it's Wayfarer hinges are between 8 and 5 degrees, and if I show you 6. See, if I tilt this lug, it's gonna perfectly match your arm. And because it has a 5 degrees, so you always have a little notch of material here. So it's always good to then just basically use your files and make it smooth with the arm, but you probably know that already. So this is for the Wayfarer hinges. I found them sometimes a bit tricky, and I'm not a big fan of big lugs. It depends on a shape of the frame, and there's always a way how to make them visually slightly smaller. So for example, if I want them to look slightly smaller, I'm just in a real life make this edge rounded like this, and it will look eventually slightly smaller in a real life if you make this edge rounded. So that's just a little trick. If you want to use these hinges and it's visually bothering you that the lug is massive, that's quite a good trick to get away with that. That's this hinge. Then we can go to the heat sunk hinge, which I'm normally, because I'm not using the the wires with a pre-shot hinges, so every time I'm using the heat sunk front and still rivets on sides. Some people are having the hinges on a wire, so this is much easier and you don't need to sort this out. But if you buy these kind of hinges, you need to again measure your hinge itself, plus add the little bit of material for the arms, and in my case it's giving me 8.2 millimeters from the edge of the lug. Again, something similar to narrow facial width, but you can get these hinges smaller, and I'll quite recommend you to, if you use heat sunk, it's a bit tricky because you kind of losing a little bit more, like a little bit of adjustability, and it's a bit finicky sometimes to work this hinge, and I'm always scared that I'm gonna rip it out of the material if I try to adjust pantoscopic tilt or playing with arms. So I will definitely recommend you to use heat sunk hinges which has this shape, which is not just a single anchor, but it's basically two, and the material is all around this, and they holds really well in the material. Here in this picture you can see because I'm pretty sure if you are using these hinges before, you always have the problems that when you press them in, you have a lot of material around the hinge. Basically all the heated material or melted is going around the hinge. So I would recommend you, when you do something like this, not doing just to prepare yourself a little recess for the hinge itself, and make another recess on CNC for the extra material, so it can go nicely around the hinge, but it won't go all the way up, and you don't need to clean anything afterwards. So if you look back here, I have here basically 8.21 millimeter, and let's look at the hinge itself. And I didn't bother here with making the rounded edges on this, because rounded edges is gonna be done by the cutting tool anyway. So I just make the geometry. This inside square is actually where you need to press your hinge. This is these two anchors, and this big one is basically this face. So if you look at the frame, so this is like a 2 millimeter deep inside for the hinge itself, and just let's say 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter for the outside of the hinge. And if you look at the geometry, you can see I put 8.25 from the edge of the frame, and in real life it looks spot on. As you can see, again, the 4 millimeter arms, and it fits nicely. So that's about the heatsunk hinge. And the last one I'm using quite often is a small hinge, and I'm using it quite often because if I'm doing some small panto frame with, let's say, with arms that I want them maybe around 5 millimeters, super small ones. This is the perfect hinge, because otherwise, if you use larger hinge, they are almost sitting on the edge of the arms, and it doesn't look good, and eventually they can become a little bit loose. And I really like using them because normally they are selling them only with a 0 pantoscopic tilt, but it doesn't really matter because they are so small. You can always bend them and add the pantoscopic tilt afterwards. And where is it? Sorry. Yeah, I choose this kind of shape for this frame. And the quite tricky thing about this is normally they are huge, so you need a huge lugs for them. So you need to incorporate it in your design. And this one is almost 13 millimeters you need from the edge of the hinge to your material. So as you can see, I still have a little bit of space here for that hinge, so I can modify it a little bit. I can change the lugs a little bit, but normally it looks quite okay like this. And there's a little trick if you have arms like this, like a super thin one. What I'm quite often doing is making the lugs rounded. So if you imagine having this lug and this lug, let's say put 2 millimeters, and then make also your arms rounded like this. So it will make like a nice transition, and it's not as harsh as if you have a straight arms like this. So I think it looks much nicer if you make this rounded, and it's very easy when you do the mitering correctly, and then just with a sanding sponge, it's very easy to make a shape like this afterwards. And if you look at the recess, sorry, it looks like, again, I have here 13 millimeters, but as you can see, still I have quite a lot of material here. So what I can do, I can go back to my sketch and maybe pull the lug a little bit inside. It might be slightly too big. When you open your, when you have your geometry, and because I'm lazy and I always have these geometries already prepared, for example here, and if I open it, I have all the measurements here and everything. But when you, what I'm usually doing is just take this sketch, select it, copy, and then insert it here on this frame. But the moment when you when you make a new sketch here and insert your sketch, it's normally losing the dimensions or something, so it's not sometimes that easy. It's quite easy to mess up your shape, so you need to be quite careful to not make any mistakes in this case. But normally when you do this, you're not gonna copy paste your recess for the hinges, but you will always make this like a little thing, new one, and this won't happen. So normally these are the basically the 4 hinges that I'm using the most. And there's a little trick, especially when you have a frame like this. I'm gonna delete this recess. When you make your frame like this and you have you're gonna do your recess, and then you will know that it will perfectly fit your arms like this. But the moment when you do this, it's always good to left a little bit of material here, so you can have nice and sharp mitering, and especially when you do this and put your frame in a barrels. So it's what I'm usually doing is, I'm gonna also do this, just and hide this and this. I'm always adding a little bit of extra material here that I will cut afterwards when it's after barreling. So I'm just gonna press here the solid and extrude and press on this face and add, let's say, between 2 and 5 millimeters. So I think in this case we can add just 3 millimeters, and it will look really weird when you make the frame. It will look like you completely messed up the geometry and everything. But this is the part that you will afterwards, when you have the frame ready, this will be completely rounded from the barrels. It will look basically something like this. Something like this, and that's not a problem, because you can cut it off with a file and then make nice mitering. But if you imagine that you don't have this, and suddenly you put it in a barrels, it will look like this, and then you have almost no chance to make a nice mitering. So I always recommend you to add a little bit of materials, otherwise you will need to make some really bad looking mitering and transition between front and side. Yeah, is there just it was fairly quick, and is there any questions about hinges, or are you using something else, or do you is it quite clear how to measure your hinge?
I think it's quite clear. I had one query though. These drawings, are you making them individually, or I mean the hinge drawings for the measurements?
No, I'm not doing them for every single hinge, because that was the only hinges I already have in 3D models when I was doing some rendering for customers. So I wanted to have something what looks in a real life. But normally I'm just gonna measure it and make that little square with the rounded edges, and that's it for me as for the hinge recess.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
I think it's doable maybe to create this kind of hinge in Fusion, and every time you have a new hinge you can just modify it a little bit. But for me this is a little bit of extra work, and it's literally good only for when you're doing renderings, because if you look at this, and if I turn off the edges, it will actually look pretty nice when you playing with this, and it looks almost like a real life thing, especially when it's nicely fitted. I can add some different material, and then you can make quite nice visualization how this will look. Perfect. Thank you for your question. Anything else?
Hey, Mate, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have a minimum distance from the edge of the lens to where you place the hinge for just in general for each of those hinges?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we look here, normally I'm trying to be because I had some issues in the past because I'm always doing the recess slightly smaller than hinge, and when I pressed it in, sometimes basically I made a little bulb here when it was way too close to the rim. So I'm always trying to be at least 1 millimeter, like 1 millimeter would be minimum for me, the distance between this lens shape and the hinge. I think, and it's only for the riveting hinges. If you do the heat-sunk hinges, I will go at least 2 millimeters because it can go because you need to press something inside of the material, and this can completely mess up your groove for lenses.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No worries. Do you want me guys to show you like to make one frame and show you how to add the geometry, or how to do this almost manually? Because I can actually show you.
Yeah.
I can just okay. So we can start with a new frame as usual. I'm gonna look at the top of my thing, add canvas, which is gonna be some of my frame. Let's use this one. And like if I will do something like this, let's say frame, I will definitely, for a frame like this, as you can see, like they have a double rivet here with like this front plug, and I think for this hinge I can for this kind of frame I can use very easily the Wayfarer hinge, because it looks quite chunky actually itself, or I can use a heat sunk and this will nicely disappear. I think if I use a narrow facial width, it might be a little bit weird because there's a lot of material, and then you can imagine here having two dots almost on the edge of the frame, and I think it might look a little bit weird. So I think for this one I can choose the hinges for the Wayfarer. I think it's gonna be best. So I'm gonna quickly create the shape of the frame. But first I need to change the size of the picture just to calibrate it, and I guess the overall it looks like a quite small frame, so I'll make it 140 millimeter, and then create a sketch on the top, find myself a center of the frame, which I'm gonna connect this line and this line with a little triangle showing me the center, and that's it. I have the center, and then I can make myself a lock. It's here, you can see the number, and it's telling me that the lock might be something around 7 or maybe 8 millimeters. So I can make it for 8 millimeter arm like this, and then quickly do the shape. Might look a bit different.
Are you sure you want to do a keyhole frame?
Well, I'm gonna do it now with a keyhole, but I'm not gonna do the recess for the I'm not gonna do the display, so it should be okay. This, just please ignore now that it's gonna be a little lumpy, the whole frame. Then I'm gonna, sorry, I forgot the lens. Quickly do lens. And finish sketch. Extrude the whole frame by 6mm. And farewell sketch. I'm gonna go back to visual effect with edges, so I can see it slightly better. And it's just bothered me a lot. And I'm gonna straighten the bridge like this, and straight. This one is straight, perfect. So this is the frame. I'm gonna make quickly the nose pads, which I'm gonna choose. The key for this is gonna be, I'm just gonna start the nose pads here, a little bit below when this start going down. This whole this is basically going inside, so I'm gonna start slightly below that. Then the bottom one, extrude by, let's say, 4mm, and just double check if I press join. I did. Then a little cut on the bottom, just easy, and here minus 1.5, let's say, and then here a massive 60mm radius, and 6mm here, and 6mm here, or 15mm here. So that's basically my frame. And then now I need to take a look on how I'm gonna do the recess for the hinge. So as I said, I'm gonna use this hinge, this Wayfarer hinge, and as you can see, this is my front part of the hinge. And if I look here, I can make it from scratch. So if I look at the hinge, and if I would measure it, classic hinge here, so I will know that the size of that recess I need to basically do, if I just will make a square, is going to be 6.1, and the long part is going to be 7.5, this whole thing. So I can go back to a hinge here. I'm going to create a sketch on the top of the material. It keeps turning, and I'll create that little box here and here. You can use this function 2-point rectangle. So, and then with the function sketch dimensions, I will put 7 point, I think it was 5 times, and this one was 6.1, I think. Just gonna take overview. Sorry, 6.1 and 7.5. And now I'm gonna make a rounded edges. It's here. You can use the function fillet, and it's gonna look like here and here. You select, and it's offering you here 1.5 millimeter, but it needs to be almost nice half circle. So I'm gonna use 3 millimeter. And I'm gonna do the same thing here on the bottom. and again 3 millimeter. And now the key thing is basically placing this hinge correctly on your frame. So what I'm quite often doing is, because my main geometry now for this frame is going to be this line on a lock. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to press here and modify, here, project and project, which is, or you can press key P. I'm going to press project, here geometry, and now I have basically this area locked. And I just need a center of this line, so again make a little line with a triangle, and I know this is going to be center of my lock. And as we are looking at this overview, now I need to, because now I made this is the length of my recess, but I know that I need 13.5 millimeter, because this is going to be area where the arms is going to be when I put basically where I need to place this hinge to have arms still nicely inside of the lock. So I'm gonna go back and make a line from here, from the center, all the way out, and with the distance I'm gonna measure it and put 13.5 millimeter. So as you can see now, if I would place the hinge like this, it will mean that arm will be sticking out of the frame. So I need to move this whole hinge a little bit inside of the lock. So I'm going to select all this, or I can just, well, I can do like this. And ideally I'll need to move the ideal moving now, because I have this center of my hinge and center of my lock. So I can go to modify and press move, and here is a function, if you look here, point to point. So I can select the end of this and this. Come on, why not moving? And select all this and press move and go from here to here. And you can see that actually still fits, and I have a little bit of space here between the hinge and my lens, but I think it might be better to make it a bit bigger, but for now that should be enough. But as we say that normally for these classic hinges it's better to add a little bit of extra material. So even here on the overview I measured 13.5. I think still it's going to be better to add a little extra, so I'll put 14 and then move the whole thing, select all this and press move again. Yeah, like this. Or there's another way that what you can do. You can, if you change this this thing and you can change this dimension, you can just press here sketch dimension, select this point where this is the end of your hinge, and press dimension and put between this line and this point. It's telling you it's 0.5, and you can tell him that you want it 0 or 0 point something, because it's normally it doesn't like if you put a dimension of 0, so basically nothing. And if I change now these dimensions, let's say 13, it's moving always with the end of the lock, so I can put back 14. It seems quite small, so but I can still go back to solid and make this recess minus 1 millimeter, but it's quite narrow here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to my first sketch and extend the lock a little bit out. Just basically pull it out a bit, and you can see the hinge is now moved with the lock. So if I just double check here, it's still the 40 millimeters, but it has a bit more breathing space here. So basically that would be your recess. And what you can do now, you can do the whole mirroring and select the object. The plane is going to be your center, and you will have the frame with the both recesses. And if we go back, you can add here on the end, as we are speaking, that it's always good to add a little bit of extra material. You can just press this face and add 3 millimeter, and now you can do the mirror and make the whole frame. With the recess. And what I can do, we didn't try it yet. I didn't show you how to play with, like how to add one body to another one. It's a bit tricky, but I can just do it just to see it. Testing for frame number 3. I can add the hinge here. Just need to double check. It's a hinge number 3. So I can insert and derive. So it's basically telling me that I can use some geometry from some other model. And I can select, I want this part and this part. And now I have here the hinge. So I can now, if I open here the bodies, I can see there's one part of the hinge and the second part of the hinge, and I can move it around. So if you want to see, we can select this body and this body, press M as a move, and you can start moving it around. I know this hinge is going to be on the right side of the frame, so I need to turn it like this and then navigate the hinge here in a recess. As you can see, it's a bit deeper, so I can pull it out, and ideally I would do a little bit of, let's see, like this. Again, move. And you can see now this should be perfectly okay to have a arm fitting there. There's also one little bit tricky thing, because it a little bit depends on, if we look back at the position of the hinge. Normally I'm placing the hinge on a center of the lock, which is in 85% this is the correct position. But in a moment when you have the hinge which has more than 5 degrees pantoscopic tilt, you need to move your hinge a little bit lower than the center of your lock. Because if you imagine that you're going to have the arm that is basically pointing down a little bit, it means the top edge of the arm is going to poke out of your frame. So normally if I have the hinge which has more than 5 degrees, I will just move this whole hinge area, the hinge recess, 0.5 millimeter lower than the center of the lock, and it's going to help you a little bit to get it in a correct position, and you don't need to file your arm on a top to have a smooth transition. Was it clear, or it was slightly too fast, or was it understandable how to do this kind of stuff? when I was speaking about the fact that I'm making my recess slightly smaller than the hinge itself, I'm not doing this here in the operation of 3D modeling. I'm doing this when we on the next class, or I think in 2 weeks when we're going to do class for the G code. I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of material when you're preparing your G code, and when you're programming the machining, when you add a little bit of materials as like a extra stock material around the shape. It's much easier than the changing constantly geometry to make it smaller and then remember to make it which actually works for your machine. And it also kind of depends on your machine. If you have a machine that it's not, if your CNC is not super rigid, you don't maybe need to do them, you might need to make them even slightly more smaller, because the tool is going to vibrate and it's not going to be perfect size of the recess. Sometimes there can be a little bit of issue, because if you look at the hinge itself, it has like a sharp corner here, as you can see. But when you do your frame, when you machine this recess, it's not going to look like this, but here in this and this corner, you're going to have something like this because of your tool. So normally it's not a really big issue to have this, because you can still, because it's just a little bit of material, and you can still press it when you put the hinge on the front part, and the back part you can press with your clavellus inside of the recess. It's okay. But sometimes this is maybe slightly too much, and what I'm usually doing is just basically use the knife and cut a little edge here to just to make slightly easier transition for the press fitting the hinge. But that's something that you can try eventually, and it's not a big deal. You can also make the recess longer than the hinge itself, just to prevent this, but then it's getting a bit tricky to hold the hinge in a position when you're drilling the holes with the hinge. So I like to have them in a perfect position, so the holes are on both sides in a perfect position. Or is there any other hinges that you are using and I didn't cover, or do you think there's them? I didn't cover the flexi hinges, because to be honest, I didn't use them for ages now. But if there's a need, I can make again the short class just on a flexi hinges, because they are a bit more specific and they need a specific tool for sides if you don't have the sides already on a wire. But I can also cover that.